My name is Adeoye Akinola. I'm the senior researcher in the Universities of Johannesburg's Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation in South Africa. I'm going to be the chair of today's event, and I thank everyone for making out the time to attend the highly engaging meeting despite the confusion created by the COVID-19. The title for today's intellectual conversation is The Impact of COVID-19 on African-European Union Migration. The meeting is a first of two jointly organized series by the University of Johannesburg's Institute of Pan-African Thought and Conversation in South Africa and the Nordic African Institute in Sweden. And the intent is to consolidate on a community of practice, COP, on implementing the UN Global Compact on Migration. This informal group consists of African and EU government officials and other experts on migration across the two continents. The COP itself was created from two meetings in 2018 and 2019 on building convergence on Africa-EU migration. The second seminar we hold on the 26th of June 2020, and you are all invited to the webinar. The two institutes are also collaborating on an edited volume on Africa-EU migration, which will be published in 2021. Policy briefs and newspaper articles are part of the outputs of our engagement. At this point in time, we also want to appreciate our partner, the University of Johannesburg Library, for making this meeting possible. We also recognize the presence of the two directors of the two institutes in our midst. Thank you. There are rules of engagement. There are instructions that will help us to actually engage in a desired way. Please also note that questionnaires will be sent out after the meeting for the purpose of evaluating the meeting itself. Please kindly complete this and return to us. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to present. And after that, we'll have the question and answer, where people will have the opportunity to raise questions and actually the speakers will provide answers. The speakers know that they also have to at least give us about 2 policy recommendations in relation to African EU migration. Even when you're asking your question, we are trying to also encourage you to also provide some policy recommendations. This is how the question and answer forum will be like. We'll have about 2 or 3 rounds, depending on the kinds of engagement we'll have. We will take about 5 questions per round, so that I will take 5 questions and we'll allow the speakers to respond. Then we will take the other set of questions after they must have responded. At this point in time, I am absolutely sure that the 2 speakers are ready for us. Please permit me to introduce our speakers, Dr. Ahmed Bugre and Dr. Francisca Sanka, who are accomplished experts on migration from both the perspectives of Africa and that of the EU. Incidentally, both of them are contributors to our book volume, which will soon be published. Also, permit me to introduce Dr. Bugre at this point. Dr. Bugre is an advisor in the Office of the Commissioner for Social Affairs in the African Union Commission. He's actually joining us from Malta, Italy. Dr. Bugre, you are welcome. Our second speaker is Dr. Francisca Sanka, who is a senior research fellow and head of cluster pattern of forced migration in Arnold Bergstrasse Institute, Freiburg in Germany. I have the honor of inviting Dr. Ahmed Bugri to make a 10-minute presentation. May I remind Dr. Bugri and Dr. Sankar that I have a military background. And when I say 10 minutes, it's 10 minutes. Thank you. You have the floor, Dr. Ahmed Bugri.
It's a pleasure to join you this afternoon in this very important webinar and discussions, of course, on a subject that is very, very important, but also that is very current, and looking at the impact of COVID-19 on EU relations, especially vis-a-vis migration. I would like to set the context to which we are talking in looking at the relationship between Africa and EU, but also to look at also some figures, some current figures, the figures in the past, but also currently, and the impact of COVID on the situation of migration. And then I will also set some recommendations, as you've said. I mean, the EU and Africa, or the AU, as now it used to be EU-Africa relations, but now it's AU-EU relations because Morocco has now joined the African Union, so the whole union is complete. I mean, Africa and Europe are not only neighbors, but they also have a historical connection through colonization, through trade relations. So the two continents are very close. The movement of people between Europe and Africa happened some time ago, and the movement of Africans nowadays to Europe is not something very new. The diaspora in Europe is quite large, and that shows the relationship between these two continents. On a political level, the relationship between the EU and the AU is built on the Africa-EU partnership, which was started in the year 2000, when in the summit in Cairo. That was when Africa and the European Union took the steps to formalize their relationship. And under this, migration was one of the subjects which was actually discussed, which led to the Abuja Treaty, which looked at the free movement of Africans in Africa, because the movement of people in Africa is not something new. It has always existed. The demographic of Africa is shaped by the people, by the movement of people. In fact, the creation of borders has been done by European colonization of Africa anyway. So we know that the Berlin Conference divided Africa into these artificial borderlands. However, movement in Africa is not something new. It has shaped our history. It has shaped our trade relations. It has shaped everything. So in 2000, in fact, when the Abuja, in 2000, migration was one of the subjects that was discussed in this, which led to 2006, the adoption of the African Common Position on Migration and Development. Because for Africa, migration is a developmental issue. Whilst we can see that from the European perspective, migration is not necessarily a developmental issue, but it's a security issue. And I think that I will come back to this and see how these relations has always affected how both continents have seen the movement of people between these two continents. In 2007, we had the joint Africa-EU strategy. And among it also, there was the adoption of the purposes of the implementation of the Millennium Goals at that time, that migration was supposed to be managed, especially in terms of irregular migration. Whilst we know that 80% of all movement of persons in Africa happens within the continent, the European Union have always taken the view, or people have taken the view, that Africans are moving out of the continent into other areas. But research has shown, that a majority, over 80% of the movement of people in Africa remain in Africa. And that migration is beneficial to the African continent, because the root causes of migration are well known. Political instability, lack of opportunities for young people, you have conflict, you have political instability. All the reasons why people move out, or many young people move out, is because it's acknowledged that these instabilities are causing people to move out of Africa, even to neighboring countries, to find better opportunities. So let me come now to how this has been implemented. In the implementation of the JES, the focus has always been that the EU has always emphasized on the management, on managing migration, or controlling migration, especially irregular migration of African young people to Europe, whilst not emphasizing on the developmental aspect, on the root causes of migration. Because we believe that when you deal with the root causes of migration, that stems from underdevelopment or less development within Africa itself, and that even in itself can come back to historical issues, trade relations with Europe. Whilst Europe wants to give Africa, Africans have been telling Europe, we need a level playing field for trade, but Europe will rather concentrate on giving Africa aid than actually opening a level playing field for trade. For example, SMEs are destroyed because of the common agricultural policies of the African Union, where many countries in the EU are able to dump their goods in Africa at cheaper prices. But now it is even easier, it is even cheaper to import chicken or to import dairy products from Europe than to have milk or to raise cows in Africa. So the contributing factors of the mobility of young people towards Europe is a developmental issue. Now let me come to this year. When people come to Europe, usually the problem is that a majority of people receive refugee status. So many of them are given temporary statuses to work in farms, they work in factories, they work in cleaning garbages, so because of the demographic dividends in Europe need workers, and African migrants tend to fill in these positions which are left vacant by people. Now this year, before COVID, the situation was very, very difficult. However, with COVID, it has even made the situation much more worse. Yeah, it has exacerbated because the conditions or the root causes of migration are still there. But now countries have been hit by COVID-19, and we can see that in the first quarter of this year, or from January until this year, I can give you some statistics. There were 21,970 arrivals through the central Mediterranean route alone. And this is countries from Greece, Spain, Cyprus, Italy, and Malta. 3,491 have arrived by land. So far, we have 186 people who have lost their lives or are missing. Yeah, and as you can see, 6,816 of these are from Africa. So meaning that nearly 1/3 of the people who have arrived in Europe are Africans. Yeah, which means that the number is very insignificant. 6,800 people, not even 7,000 people, is something which can be managed. But because of COVID, European Union and other countries like African countries have closed their borders. And we have read about what has happened in the Mediterranean, where in Easter, the Maltese government and the Italian government had refused to disembark people who were rescued at sea and asylum seekers, and 5 people perished in the boat out of thirst, and 7 are missing to date. Within that time, there were over 400 people who were rescued at sea and held out at sea by the Maltese authorities, not wanting to allow them to come in because the invocation was that we are under security, we are under the threat of COVID-19. The foundation of the joint AU-EU relationship is built on principles of democracy and human rights. But we have seen the violation of human rights, not only in Africa, but also within Europe. And in fact, the Council of Europe have condemned the treatment of asylum seekers by Malta and by Italy and Greece at their borders. And they have issued, and now the European Parliament have actually ceased to provide funding for the Libyan Coast Guards. So COVID-19 has made the situation quite worse. The second aspect is that now that many of the people who are in Europe, because of lockdown, have lost their jobs, and the closure of factories have lost their jobs, there is a push in Europe now to deport or to repatriate a majority of the Africans who had arrived here as asylum seekers but had not settled down back to Africa, which means that the European Union will start, or European Union countries will start negotiating bilateral agreement with African countries to take these young people back. And the question is, what will they come to do? If they could not find work in Europe, what will they come back to Africa and they will do? What about those who are staying in Europe and have worked for many years, have paid into the social security system, and are not able to claim these rights back when they come back home? Let me give you some statistics also now. 58%, nearly 59% of those who have arrived are men. Just 1 minute and I'll conclude. 16% are women, 25% are young people, which means that over 41% of asylum seekers from Africa are vulnerable. Therefore, my recommendation would be, number one, to look at the implementation of the protocol on free movement of persons, because this was the intention of this protocol was to enhance the movement of people in Africa to give opportunity. The second is to have an alternative for a viable return and reintegration policy that the African Union can spearhead with the EU. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed Bougre, who is an advisor in the Office of the Commissioner for Social Affairs in the African Union Commission. He has actually joined us from Malta. Thank you so much for your presentation. Let me just summarize in one sentence. And the main point of what he had shared with us is just that there's two perspectives here. The European, they focus more on controlling irregular migration, while Africans wants to look at it from developmental angle. And he was trying to argue that EU keep giving aids instead of interrogating the root causes of migration. Let's hear from Dr. Francisca Sanka, who is a senior research fellow and head of cluster pattern of forced migration and at Baxtresser Institute, Freiburg in Germany. Dr. Francisca Sanka, you are welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you also very much for the invitation to speak here today. I'm very happy to be joining you. Just to start off with a very small caveat, I mostly work on migration and refugee governance in Africa, not in Europe, but I will do my best to give a European perspective on it anyway. What I wanted to say today, I think, reflects quite well what has already been said by Dr. Bougre. So I want to touch on 4 issues in the next 10 minutes. First of all, taking stock a little bit of EU-African relations on migration. And secondly, talking a little bit about the effects of COVID-19 on migration in Africa, and then on what it means for migration in the EU in relation to Africa. And I will end with some policy proposals as well, or some ideas to consider. So first of all, taking stock. So of course, we already heard a little bit about the evolution of the relationship between the 2 continents. And just as Dr. Bougre said, I want to reiterate that on the one hand, we have the African continent, and let me just generalize for the sake of summary, where there's a widely held perception of migration as an opportunity for development. So for example, both Senegal and Nigeria have enshrined the right to migrate in their constitutions and in relevant policy documents. And in particular, we of course have remittances that hold huge social and political importance on the continent, often making larger contributions to the GDP than overseas development assistance and other external aids. So this is on the one hand. And on the other hand, especially in the last 5 years, the EU and the member states have become increasingly interested in dealing with migration governance in Africa. And broadly speaking, again, the European interest is in stopping irregular migration to Europe. To incentivize such corporations, projects that target the so-called root causes of migration have been adopted, often under the framework of the European EU Trust Fund. And these projects have been fast in their setup, large in number and in size. And just to give one example, Niger, which is one of the countries that has benefited the most from this, has 12 projects to the tune of 253 million euros in the country, which makes up about 3% of the GDP. Of course, this drive to improve migration cooperation is not without effects, as has just been already mentioned as well, and complicates the relationship between the two continents. So in some of my recent research on migration governance in Nigeria, Senegal, Niger, and the Gambia, my co-authors and I found adverse effects on local ownership and increasing conflict over institutional mandates when it came to designing migration governance architectures in these West African countries due to the EU influence. The issue of return has been mentioned, and forced return through readmissions agreement with the EU or their member states is of course hugely unpopular in Africa and threatens the domestic legitimacy of many governments, making it very difficult for them to comply. And this has become one of the most significant stress tests for the relationship between the EU and in particular countries in West Africa. And despite these challenges, and I've only mentioned a few of them, there's a strong rhetorical commitment to an equal partnership from the EU, as outlined by the recent new strategy on EU-AU relations, which was published in March, and which called on the principles of solidarity, partnership, and shared responsibility. Coming to my second point, which will be very short, just to mention a few of the implications about the coronavirus and migration in Africa. We do know that migrant and refugee populations are, of course, particularly vulnerable to the effects of social distancing measures, often already living in crowded conditions. And despite this, funding for refugees, especially those living in camps, have already been reduced. For example, Uganda, which hosts over 1 million refugees, has reported funding cuts of 30% already to their budgets because of Corona. So the budget's dedicated to refugee protection. Refugee resettlement has also been brought to a complete standstill, worsening situations which were already in backlog, like in Niger, where evacuees from Libya are awaiting resettlement. And thirdly, of course, across the continent, like all over the world, there's been complete or partial border closures. And not only does this detrimentally affect the basic livelihood chances of many parts of the population who depend on being able to cross the border, it also risks excluding refugees who are seeking protection at this time and who need to cross international borders. So having briefly discussed this, I wanted to go back to Europe and what this means for migration between Africa and Europe. And this is obviously an exceptional global situation, but for the EU as an institution, it also comes at a time when they're already facing some of the biggest internal challenges. They're already divided because of Brexit. There's a very uncoordinated COVID response, to say the least, and a very different takes on migration, and a common EU asylum system are not looking any easier to resolve. All eyes are on a new pact on migration and asylum, which is due to be released soon, and whether a different approach will then be feasible. The lack of concerted efforts in addressing human rights violations taking place in refugee camps in Greece or countries like Italy or Malta, as has just been mentioned, closing their seaports to refugees and other migrants rescued at sea, do not exactly give us much hope. But there have been some countries all over the world, including some in Europe, like Portugal or Ireland, that have recognized that the corona pandemic warrants an inclusive approach to all residents of a country, no matter what their status may hold. And there's been measures like visa and residency, permit extension, stays on deportations, and releases from immigration detentions so far. And I think, if anything, the corona pandemic has reshuffled the cards for Europe, its citizens and politicians, in two ways. It has shown the very privileged Europe the fragility of free movement. The global pandemic brought most movements to a halt quite abruptly. And the global health crisis shows us both that we are very interconnected on the planet and how important travel is for many people's personal and professional lives, and what happens when they're no longer able to travel whilst others still can, like a few months ago when Europe was at the epicenter of the virus. And relatedly, with overburdened health services, fruits and vegetables waiting to be picked, supermarket workers working long hours to serve countless people panic buying toilet paper, has also highlighted the importance of key workers and what has been previously filed under low-skilled labor. It will be interesting to see if this translates into political will to actually revisit migration cooperation between the EU and Africa. And I come to my conclusion. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres released a policy brief last week where he noted the coronavirus pandemic disproportionate impact on asylum seekers and migrants. But he noted that it also represented the international community with an opportunity to reimagine human mobility for the benefit of all. So what would this mean for the EU and Africa? I'm going to end with 3 possible recommendations or ideas which we can discuss. As always, it bears repeating the EU should fulfill their resettlement obligations and be more serious about burden sharing, committing the necessary funds for displaced people in Africa. And one of the tenets of human mobility proposed by the UN in the policy brief from last week was that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And I would say this shouldn't just apply in times of a health crisis. Secondly, many scholars, civil society activists and others, and many people in this webinar today have said this for years, legal migration pathways should be more than just rhetoric. They should be accessible, visible, and credible. The pandemic has shown Europe how dependent they are on external labor forces, and this is a necessary step to stop people having to risk their lives on a dangerous journey to Europe. And the last point is that the narrative on migration and mobility really needs to be changed. So for the EU, changing the narratives means actually listening to the interests and concerns which are being voiced by African states, civil society organizations, and migrant groups, because as we also heard in the previous presentation, EU migration is continuously framed as a problem or in terms of securitization and something to be curtailed. And this stands in strong contrast to the different and multiple understandings in Africa of migration and mobility as something normal and an important livelihood strategy. Having seen how mobility changed during the pandemic, this can be used for much more open conversation at the upcoming EU-AU summit. But for African states, speaking to the narrative in Africa, regional organizations like ECOWAS and the African Union, it also means spending more consideration what movement on the continent should actually look like in order to adopt bordering practices that balance a formality, which is needed to track migration patterns, ensure anti-trafficking measures and other security issues, but with a necessary informality that's needed that allows cross-border communities to uphold their livelihoods strategy. A new vision of what free movement actually means in this context, including the kind of borders this would entail, should be a priority in the coming years, also when it comes to the implementation of the free movement protocol. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Francis Sanka. Please let me quickly inform our guests that you can post your questions on the Q&A section. If you have questions for any of the speakers, you can specifically mention the speakers, or you can just throw your question. Any one of them will respond to your questions. Hearing Dr. Francisca, I love the part where she argues that EU is now very committed to the issues of African migration into Europe through what she calls solidarity, partnership, and shared responsibility. We also know that COVID-19 affected both continents. European countries are also struggling the same way that African countries are struggling. And to compound the plight of European states is the case of Brexit, for instance. So, but what we want to actually achieve here is actually enhance the development of some concrete and constructive policy measures to measure African and EU migration. And thank you for the two speakers. Please, you still have to respond to questions, but let me come around to our guest. I have some questions that have been posted by the site. So please, Abdul Karim El Gonin, please, can you ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, I really enjoyed the two papers, the discussion of the two papers. But to me, I want to take a small different road, saying, as was put in the question, is that the Gulf states have more migrants than nationals. And they are doing what the European Union is doing, which is mainly managing and regulating migration. So why the problem is not very bad in the Gulf as it is in Europe? Is it because Europe has more power on the push factors in Africa? And then we need to look at it more seriously. And instead of just looking at the science, we go to the disease itself and do something about it and not play around the bush. Can we push policies in that direction? When you speak today of something that happened in Mali for $200 million, you see in Mali, $200 million, $150 million will drop between the cracks. And what goes for the project is just a third of what has been paid. It won't solve a problem, it is just a drop in the ocean. So I think we need to think differently about this migration and the right of movement between countries and between Africa and Europe.
Okay, my question is for Dr. Ahmed. I want to agree that security remains a problem. Initially, it was physical security, but now we have the issue of health security. But what I really want to know from your statistics, did COVID-19 border closure reduce the outflow? If not, which means there's a problem with the border. Again, I also want to see there are areas of multilateral and AU policies on migration. Then my other question is for Zanka. There's the issue of asymmetry, balance of power, unequal balance in decision making, and even partnership, because I don't see the French, let's say for example, Senegal or Benin sitting at the same table and looking at the French counterparts and discussing with them on how borders should be managed in Africa, the colonial masters. Do you think EU externalization, because you're creating so many, funding so many detention camps in Libya to keep people down, and when you rescue them from the sea, you bring them back to those camps that are so appalling, that are not human rights compliant. Do you think it's solving the problem? Because if it's not solving the problem, of course, then we need to look at other methods of doing things. Because if you keep giving, you are funding even those facilities more than development in other parts of Africa, then I think part of my policy input is that we should think proactively. We need to do more with border management. That's if even intra-African migration will work as expected, because a very good example at the regional level is the ECOWAS model. And I remember initially there was influx of migrants to other more developed economies in West Africa, but now that the visa regulation has been abolished, especially with ECOWAS, you find that traders could come in from Cote d'Ivoire in the morning and get back in the evening. So if we abolish this visa of the thing and make mobility much more friendly, I think intra-African migration will work better? Because I am very, very cocksure about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So my name is Thomas Kalungen from the Rock Agency, which is in Berlin. One of our major jobs is tackling the problem of misinformation and disinformation. And both of the speakers have well said that the AU specific on migration is on security, while the African Union is on development and opportunity recognition. So this security purpose in Europe is majorly because of misinformation and political orientations, especially towards the right. What policy recommendations could the two speakers have of tackling the misinformation and disinformation in regard to migration, especially migration from Africa? That's my first question. The second question is, we have, as the former question was, we have various regional agreements in Africa, like the Africa Free Trade Agreement. How do they think this particular agreement can be implemented in a post-COVID-19 situation, whereby, as we have seen, for example, a case of Tanzania and Kenya, where we have problems of migration, even of trade goods having problems moving from one country to another? Those are my questions. Thank you so much.
My name is Jan Bader from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. I have a question to both speakers on intra-African migration. I was wondering, because in Europe we've seen that the Schengen area has caused many problems between countries that have different views on migration. So I was wondering what could the REX or Africa learn from the mistakes that Europe has made on migration within the Schengen area? Thank you.
Okay, sure. I'll try to answer them as best as I can, and what I wrote down here, and I'm sure Dr. Bugre will correct me and expand when he responds after me. So the first question from Abdul Karim Okoni, what about, how does it work with the Gulf or the Gulf states have more migrants, or it's better regulated there than the EU? I think better regulation is definitely a good thing, and something that other parts of the world should also aspire to, like the EU. But I also do think that, not even if formally there's a better regulated system maybe between the two continents, that's not to say that, things individually are easy. And this is speaking to some of the research also done by Mary Citrana, who I think is with us here. I saw you're asking a question earlier, so maybe you can also expand on this, that, for individual migrants going to the Gulf states and being there and then also coming back, as we know now, also during Corona, lots of migrants from Africa are stuck in Gulf states and don't earn any more money but can't return home either. It's not like everything is perfect either. But of course, definitely I would also agree that a more regulated system would be the preferred option. The next question from Willie Esalebo, is the externalization approach from the EU solving the problem? Absolutely not, and it comes at huge humanitarian costs. So I don't think this is something viable or makes sense to follow at all in any shape or form. And but unfortunately, this is EU politicians and policymakers and member states trying to, I guess, speak to their own populations or doing things which they think is something that is wanted. And I think that's why one of the policy recommendations that I made, and that is made so many times, it almost feels redundant, but again, it still remains so true, is legal migration pathways, which still, are just barely, basically non-existent between Africa and Europe. There's so few people who are able to come to Europe legally for work and study, and that is a huge problem. And I think this is this comes at this great humanitarian cost and needs to be repeated many times. And I think this ties in quite well into the question from Thomas Kalunge about misinformation. Yes, there is definitely a lot of misinformation. There's a lot in Europe about migration from Africa, migration generally, but in particular from Africa. And what can we do? I think, the main thing is to try and when we do this kind of research, to step outside our academic ivory towers and make our research available in a transparent, informative way that hopefully media and interested public can look at it and can try to understand what's going on. And I know, for example, NAI and Jesper has written a nice policy brief on some of these myths and facts a few months ago. So, this is exactly the kind of things that we need. And of course, we also need African voices in Europe to tell us about what's going on and to give their perspectives on what's happening, and to continuously advocate for that space to be there. What can intra-African migration, and what can the RECs learn from the Schengen, and what mistakes have been made there? I can't really speak to to all the details of the Schengen agreement. I don't work on Europe. But I do think, as I try to speak to in my last policy recommendation, Africa, including the regional organizations, but also the African Union needs to think about how mobility works in the African context for those borders, that don't really make sense or only make partial sense, because I think a lot of what's happening now, as well as especially in West Africa, where the EU is putting a lot of money into this, is a mirroring of what they think borders should look like, or what maybe some, external borders of Schengen look like. And that doesn't necessarily make sense for the continent. And I'm not sure if asking what can be learned from Schengen is the right way to go. But having said that, I'm not an expert on Schengen. So, all right.
Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Bukri.
Thank you so much. Just to add on to what my colleague has just said now on the issue of this of the Middle East, the emphasis is on the AU-EU partnership, because it is an established partnership based on agreements, based on treaties, based on policy frameworks. So the relationship between Africa and the Middle East is not defined in anything. Most of the people who end up in the Middle East are recruited by recruitment agencies to go and work as domestic workers. So the framework, who will the AU deal with in the Gulf states? There's no agreement based like the agreement between the EU and the AU. So far in migration policy, this is the only framework that we have, the Joint Africa-Europe Partnership, which can become a model. And it has been accepted that this will actually become a model with Africa's relationship with other places. Africa wants to establish relationships with China or with the Middle East or with the Gulf states, and they want to use this model, especially this new Africa relationship with Europe. The second part of it is that I want to talk about is what my friend William Asolabo has just said, and I send him my greetings from here, Prof. COVID-19 has actually reduced the number of arrivals. Let me give you some statistics that have been put up by UNHCR. In April this year, there was a 70% decrease in the arrivals, especially in the Central Mediterranean route. 70% decrease. And that goes on to what Francisca has said. The EU has invested millions of euros to make Niger an impregnable place. Or they have spent about 400 million euros to support the Libyan coast guards to refund people back to Africa. So it is not, and this has caused a problem because it causes a problem in terms of human rights. The right to migrate and the right to seek asylum in a different state is a right guaranteed by international law. But the EU has worked against that by putting money to African countries, and these are AU member states who are implementing these policies. So it's externalized. The borders of the EU has been pushed all the way to the Sahel. And that's the problem. It's not because because the root causes are reduced. The conflicts in Africa are still the same. Boko Haram is still the same. Central African Republic, Congo, name it, Ivory Coast, Gambia. these economies are not stable, and that's why people are moving. So if you block it and you don't deal with the root causes, then you cause people to suffer. The movement are not going to decrease. In fact, Malta and Italy and Greece and Spain are planning that since our summer months are opening and there's a reduction now in the border containment, we are expecting many people again to go to traffickers to cross the Mediterranean Sea. So there are millions of people waiting in Libya or in Algeria or in Agadez, waiting to have any opportunity to move. Also, although physically the numbers have reduced, but the people are still waiting at transit points. And this comes down to what we're talking about in terms of communication. The EU is able to communicate. It has the machinery to communicate. From the African side, there is silence. For example, you know, what happened in the Mediterranean during the Easter time and the rescue of people and the deaths. In Europe, civil society were very vocal. They wrote about it. From the African side, it was silence. There was nothing even reported in the African media about the suffering of African young people being rescued and dying at sea or in the desert. So we need to improve the communication side from the African side. And this is a role that the African Union, you know, can play, but also it's a role also of civil society and the diaspora. That is what we as African diaspora, we try to do. We try to advocate, we try to magnify these problems so that we can make noise about it, yeah? And then it causes us as an advocacy tool. But also we hold the governments responsible. Our governments in Europe, we hold them responsible, but sometimes it is difficult to hold the governments in Africa responsible because the relationship between the diaspora and their governments is not so good, yeah? So you are playing this game where you are trying to raise up the issues, but you don't want to annoy African governments who don't want to be questioned or who don't want their civil society to question what they are doing. Lastly, I think that the diaspora can also play a role in providing capacity building and knowledge sharing. Some of us who are working in this field can support in the policy directions as well. If it comes to CFTA, we can see the impact of COVID, that the transmission of COVID has been through truck drivers from Tanzania to Kenya or from Kenya to Uganda. And so this has actually helped spread COVID, which comes in the implementation now of the free movement protocol. Health was not seen, it was just visa and allowing people to move. But COVID has shown us that security can also be self-security because many African countries, when COVID came, shut their borders and still have shut their borders, you know? And this again has an impact negatively also on the free movement of persons. So we need to invest in our health infrastructure if we want to look at the free movement on the continent. Finally, I want to come to the idea of our colleague from Holland, and I send my greetings from here also to a good friend. If you see what Europe did was that many countries closed their borders, but there was a systematic coordination between the countries to open their borders. So Germany opens its border with Czech Republic. You know, Germany opens its border with Austria. In Africa, we don't see the same coordination. Who is coordinating between these countries who have closed their borders? Every government has taken their united decision and they will open their border when they feel like, or they will keep their borders open without consideration of the other countries. So I think that there's also the lack of this coordination mechanism that should also come also in the implementation of the free movement protocol. And I think that this is why many African countries are very hesitant to ratify the protocol. Yeah, only 4 countries have ratified the protocol. And I think that the African Union would do well to sensitize member states, to open this protocol, to discuss these issues, especially in view of COVID, to find solutions for it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed Bougri. Our guest, please, we also need to balance the discussions. Please permit me to actually speak to our guests from Europe. I think we will give you the opportunities to actually raise so many questions. The two speakers are willing to respond to your questions. For instance, if I will ask you, not the speakers, I'm just trying to trigger the discussions, how will COVID-19 influence the conversation around migration going forward? Will it still be the same in Europe? How would the European Union, for instance, respond to this pandemic in the context of migration? Will our European guests raise questions or comments? Thank you. Please, we can just identify and put up your hands so that they can recognize you. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. My name is Marco Funk. I work for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Brussels. And I actually had my hand up before as well. So I do have a question for the speakers, but briefly from the European perspective, I think that we need to acknowledge that there is a discussion going on in Europe as well. There is no homogeneous opinion on policy. I mean, yes, the dominant narrative has been quite securitized, and policy has been quite security focused on migration. But there is also a vocal counter narrative on this issue coming from civil society and also within governments. Within the political sphere. So opposition parties to the government, for example, in many countries have been criticizing the securitized approach. So yeah, I just want to make sure that it's clear that there is no one single opinion on this issue also on the European side. And my question to the speakers is whether this is the same in Africa as well. Do all African policymakers share a very positive view of migration driven by developmental concerns, or recognizing it as a purely positive force for development, or is there also concern about things like brain drain? Just wondering whether there is a consensus on the African side on this issue, or whether opinions there are also quite divided as they are here in Europe. This is a very, very polarizing topic, both among the public as well as in policy circles. So it would be interesting to hear how it plays out in Africa as well, and whether that has an impact on the way that policies are made, or whether there is even within countries some sort of competition between certain actors, maybe between different ministries, as is sometimes the case in Europe. Thank you.
This is from European perspective, and that's why I quickly want to read it. And the person doesn't want to speak. Maybe what COVID is posing to us is whether African migrants who are perceived to be risking their lives will still do the same, knowing that where they are seen as greener fields is also struggling to contain COVID-19. Will they prefer to be in their home countries or still want to be in Europe? That's the question Mary Setrana is posing to our speakers. Any one of you will answer later on. So can we entertain more questions, maybe two more, then we ask them to respond.
Hi, Francisca and Ahmed. It's good to connect with you online. Very interesting perspectives that you've raised. My question, well, it's a comment tied to a question. What I've noticed, or what we've noticed, is that COVID-19 has exposed certain realities in different African countries, which are the opportunities that exist in the different sectors. And I'll just refer to Kenya as an example. In the manufacturing sector, we've seen a boom in local manufacturing of production of the PPEs, and also just some of the hand sanitizers, and also just meeting the needs of the local community or the population when it comes to food and other items, food items and non-food items. So I'm wondering how African countries can take advantage of that to be able to create opportunities for their nationals in terms of employment, by learning from this experience as to what is driving people to different countries, whether it's in the region or to Europe or to other parts of the globe, to be able to now ensure that people can actually get job opportunities within their locality or in another town within their own country. and reduce the need to migrate. So then it becomes more of a choice. And that's talking about maybe advocating for certain policies that have been challenged at this present time, because there are policies and initiatives that have been put in place that are not actually working, or they're finding it difficult to operate because they did not consider the migration question. So I think my question is more about what can African countries do to take advantage of the COVID-19 to actually develop their sectors so that people can actually get opportunities within their country and not have to think about migration as the only solution.
Jesper, you want to give a comment or a question? I know you've been working on this area for years. I know you have many questions, so can we take one of them?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the two speakers. It's really a thought-provoking conversation that I'm very glad that we are able to organize here. I suppose an overall and completely impossible question to both of you would be, we as you have both evoked, we tend to see ourselves repeating the same policy recommendations endlessly, and we have acknowledged now the challenge of making research findings and insights available, but also just in making the counter narratives around migration, even within policy circles, more influential. If you could move a little bit from the what to the how and expand on so yes, we should make our findings more available, and we should engage in policy dialogues. But are there spheres or means or formats that we are missing out on in terms of influencing both policy thinking, but perhaps also public opinion around migration? Are there avenues that you could point to that we have not explored in terms of actually making an impact? I know it's an impossible question, but if you have any thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesper. Our speakers, please, will you respond to this? Let me come to Dr. Bugri first.
In the context of COVID-19, we can see that the European Union, or many countries in the European Union, had diverted most of the funds which were allocated for projects in the migration sector or field to dealing with the impact of COVID on their own citizens. Don't forget of the rise of populism in Europe. I mean, you can see actually what happened in Italy, you know, that there is actually a debate now whether Italy should prioritize giving jobs to migrants in general, including African migrants, or whether they should prioritize giving those jobs to Italian citizens. At the moment, most projects, you know, that we should implement are actually now focused inwardly. And that is going to affect somehow policy relations. But it's also an advantage because it gives us also time to rethink from the African side, but also from the European side, as these discussions are going on. It gives us time to reevaluate what we've done, and to critique what has worked, to critique what has not worked. And I think that to the question of Mr. Fong, of course, Africa has got a common position on migration and development. We have got a common position on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and there is also an African position on the migration on migration. In Europe, there is no common policy on migration. Of course, in Africa, different regions differ. For example, one of the most difficult regions that you can discuss about migration is the SADC region. You know, we see South Africa now sending people back to Malawi, or sending people back to Zimbabwe. But if it comes to ECOWAS has a very, very robust migration policy and free movement, and actually on top. So there are the regional nuances, there's the country nuances, but the good thing is that Africa can always go back and say, we have a common policy, which was signed to and agreed to by all heads of government. To the question of my dear sister Mary Setrana, and I send my regards and send my greetings from here. You know, I have met many people here, and we were actually meeting this week with some people, and I said, some of you will be better off if you go back home because you've lost your job, yeah? And the job market is going to open. And one person told me this: it is better if I die here than go home in shame. Yeah, migration in Africa is a question of culture. When you leave your country and go somewhere, the expectations on you is so much. You know, don't forget that many of these people remit money back home. Last year, the World Bank reported that Africa received $49 billion from remittances. Families depend on this money. Families send their school with this money. Family goes to hospital with this money. So sometimes it is not that people don't want to come back to Africa. They want to come back. But what will they come back to do? What is there for them to come back and do? And so you have people saying, I would rather stay. And I think that this is why Linda's intervention is quite important. Yeah, and to try and communicate to African migrants, to African young people, that there are opportunities back home. There are opportunities, especially within COVID. If African governments are able to turn COVID into a blessing, reduce import, reduce dependency on foreign imports, then we are able to create an economy. I was just recently returned back from Addis, you know, and going out to buy fresh vegetables was a very good thing. I mean, the Addis economy could just look at what is produced locally. The problem is that we export our raw materials and we import, you know, processed goods in an expensive way. So I think that I agree with Linda that we should actually look at sensitizing our young people, you know, having national programs, not discouraging movement of people, because people want to move for other reasons, for studies, for business, but we should also look at turning people again into looking inward. I mean, in Africa, before people began to move outside, they moved from the villages into the cities anyway. So mobility in Africa is part of our DNA. Parents encourage their children to travel, because when you travel, you have better opportunities. You are able to grow, you mature up, you're able to support the family. So it is not just simply, do they want to live in Europe or not? But I think it's simply because they also have the opportunity. Those who have come to Europe definitely have the opportunity to improve in their skills. So the problem is not where you are. The problem is the policies which have been in place. And unfortunately, I foresee that because of COVID, it's going to become tougher for many of the African migrants living in Europe, as the attention is turned to citizens and not to foreigners.
I will come to you.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to take the word away from you. So just to add on to the things that Ahmed has already said, I just wanted to say a little bit more about the question raised by Marco Funk, about whether there's a common position in Africa on migration and the development link. And of course, as Ahmed correctly said, you know, there are these common positions that exist, and you know, there is a big acknowledgement toward this. But of course, there are, sorry, someone just knocked on my office door. There are also some differences. So we found in our research that migration per se in some of the countries we looked at is not really a political topic. It's just something that happens, right? So people, not all across the continent are countries, you know, obsessed with migration, speaking to migration, thinking about a migration all the time. It's just, you know, it's always been part of Africa. It's part of every day. And it's this external influence, especially in West Africa, this externalization policies that have brought it into a political topic. Because of course it's also tied into significant aid money. And so some countries, for whatever reasons, are more open to, in this case, cooperating with the EU on migration, like Niger, which we mentioned, but other countries like Nigeria, for different reasons, are taking a much stronger stance in limiting the influence that the EU has in the country in terms of migration governance. And then there's also, of course, a very big difference between emigration and immigration. So the remittances are so important. Remittances are also really affected by COVID-19. This is a huge issue. that we didn't speak that much yet about, but that's, of course, a big problem. And most African states are definitely, I think, in favor of remittances, considering the big impact they have. But there are these other problems, which was already raised in the questions, like brain drain. And then it's the other side of things, which is immigration. And in terms of immigrations, we can't say that all African states, are very open towards immigrants. We already mentioned South Africa as an example. One of the first things they did in response to the coronavirus, pretty much on the same day as announcing lockdown, was also announcing that they're going to, spend money rebuilding the border fence to Zimbabwe, or building parts of the border fence to Zimbabwe, even though, and said, this was because of the pandemic, but also to stop irregular migrants entering the country. And, at the time, and still to this day, as far as I'm aware, the cases of COVID-19 in Zimbabwe is a fraction of what it is in South Africa. So this is can't really be a public health response, I think. And of course, xenophobia exists also in Africa, in different, amongst different parts of the populations in different countries. So it's a huge continent. It's very varied. There's different responses from states. There's different types of civil society actors, and so on. So, it's, even though there's this idea that migration and development on the whole is very, very important for the continent, underneath that, in terms of migration, there's lots of different stories to tell. Linda, I agree with what you've said, and I think in Europe, we now, especially in, maybe not so much anymore, but especially at the beginning of this pandemic, some European journalists were interested in covering this. What about Africa and coronavirus? I'm sure everything will go really badly. And it's, very important as well to then say about all the positive things and all the very quick reactions that took place in Africa and different African states, and also the very innovative approaches. So there has been stuff, sort of locally produced things that have happened in response. And, you would hope that these would be also given a bigger role in the long run. So I think of Kenya as well. As do correct me, Linda, if I'm wrong. I think they also announced they would give stipends to local Kenyan artists who want to make music or whatever about that had to do with coronavirus. So, these are also really the kind of things that governments need to think about and to fund now, but also in the future. And Jesper, thank you for your question. What more can we do? And I think one of the things you said, which was about sort of public opinion, this is policymakers know where to find us. If they really want to change their approach, there's lots of people in this room have been in interaction with policymakers for a long time, and they know where to find these policy briefs, and they know where to find us if they have more questions. But I think public opinion is really a big issue. And in conjunction with, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, which is also hitting Europe at the moment, and rightly so, and asking a lot of painful questions here. I think we need to think also about schools and education sectors, and bringing these things into, bringing these issues into discussions at a very early age, so children can also have a better understanding of what's going on in a more differentiated picture, because they are the future adults and voters of tomorrow. But they're, also seeing these false images and myths around them in the newspapers as they pick up. So this would be a place where I would say, I don't have expertise in this field, but that we should also think about what can we bring into school textbooks, what can we bring into the discussions at a much earlier age.
Thank you. Thank you, our two speakers. I know that many of us, we still have so many questions to ask, and many wants to give comments. And for me, it seems as if we should be here till maybe the next 2-3 hours, but we know our time is not also on our side. Please quickly permit me to allow few people to make some comments. But please, we also want to indulge you to focus more on policy recommendations, because that's what we want to see happening. So quickly, I will ask Dr. Joy Patigekwa to make her very short comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for organizing this very important webinar. I'd like to propose that trade and trade policy can help us to go a step further on resolving the questions of migration in Africa, knowing well that most migration is intra-African. And so we have the regional economic communities that you alluded to that have these protocols that speak to free movement from a rights-based approach. And I think that's important to underline, a rights-based approach, that an East African like myself has the ability, the right to move around East Africa, settle, reside at etc. A West African would have the same framework in the ECOWAS arrangement. And all of this culminates up in the acquis. That is the acquis, but it culminates up to the apex of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which, as you know, has trade in services as a critical component. And trade in services has movement of people, movement of natural persons to provide services as a critical pillar. It envisages things like independent professionals, intra-corporate transfers, business visitors, corporate service supplies, and so on and so forth, in various sectors that are interesting also for COVID when you think about it. Think about finance, think about communication, transport, professional services, the revamp of tourism, which has died from the COVID problem. And so I feel that we could look at that and embrace it as an opportunity to build on the point that was made by the Kenyan lady, Linda, that how do you use this as a base to really make trade policy support what we're seeing as a footprint of productive capacity across the continent. And I make the case that you can and you should use trade policy, because in there will be the possibility to ensure that post-COVID, you don't implement a policy that takes us back, crowding out African production because of imports that are dumped, for example. And you complement that with a policy of moving people around under the AFCFTA so that opportunities are equally available across the board. Then you should have less xenophobia, because the South Africans will find themselves in Uganda and the Ugandans will find themselves in Senegal. Thank you very much.
At this stage, permit me to invite my friend and my co-editor, Jesper, to come and give the closing remark. Jesper?
Yes, sir, I am here.
I know you're
very
always
much,
there.
Dr. Akinola. I just want to say, I want to thank the speakers. It's really wonderful to see you both, Dr. Bougre and Dr. Sankar. We know each other from many different fora, and it's really a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you for the inspiring conversation. There's obviously much more to say here, but I think we've come around the question of EU-Africa relations and the impact of COVID-19 in a very sort of inspiring and nuanced way. And also there is more to come. As you will see from the invitation, this is the first of a two-part series of webinars. So on the 26th of June, which is 2 weeks from now, at the same time, we will organize a second webinar focusing specifically on the impacts on the UN Compact for Migration and the sort of the potential impacts of the pandemic on that framework. So I would urge you all to join us again in 2 weeks' time, and also thank the entire team at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation for their excellent work in preparing this webinar. And thank you everyone for your contributions and your participation. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you again back here in 2 weeks.
Okay. Thank you, Jesper. Please, may I quickly remind you that a questionnaire will be sent out to the guests, including our speakers. Please kindly respond to this. Kindly complete and send it back to us. We appreciate everyone that has attended this meeting. We want to use this opportunity to thank our partner, the Nordic African Institute, even the University of Johannesburg Library. We want to thank our speakers, the two speakers. I would have said, I wish you safe trip back to your destinations, but in this case, I wish you all the best. Thank all our participants, and I hope you will join us next 2 weeks for the second edition of this webinar. Thank you. May God bless.
God bless you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.